Hey, it's August the 19th, 2019. George Webb on the Potomac back channel reporting. So a lot of stuff came out yesterday and this weekend about Jeffrey Epstein. I actually took a whole day and just devoured all the Epstein stuff. And it's amazing how much disinformation one story can create. The only article I found that actually was grounded in fact and research was Zero Hedge. Zero Hedge has a great article about Bob Maxwell and the Promise software. And if you follow this channel, you know we've talked about the Promise software for almost 3 years now. You know that we've been very specific. You really have people out there saying now the Promise software story seems to have new life in a lot of the literature, and it's got all kinds of capabilities in these people's imaginations that it never had. Again, I said from the very beginning, I've talked to people and worked with people who sold the Promise software. I sold software for a living, okay? I know what the Promise software did and what it couldn't do, and its new developments and its new refinements, and I'll go and talk about those for a second. It was originally funded by DEA in '73. They created some other kind of, an agency, but it was DEA. The reason why DEA wanted it was they wanted federal informants. And what Promise could offer in a case management system, basically, if a felon A was arrested on such and such a day, his arraignment's on such and such a day, he goes to the state prison on such and such a day, very much a call center type operation. But the one thing that Promise software had from the beginning was the idea of a DEA informant. The DEA informant was sort of an untouchable. It was sort of, hey, Mr. Lawman, Mr. Police Officer, you did a good job. You arrested this guy, but it turns out he's a federal asset. We're using him to develop out a network for, let's say, El Chapo or Escobar before that, or Amjad Awan or Imran Awan. Sorry, throw the fish back into the pond. He is a federal asset. And that is the one thing that was new in 1973 as DEA was being created, and there was really no provision in the criminal justice system for the concept. And that's why it got sold to, I think, 20 or 30 different DEOJ offices. Again, Bill Barr has now been brought into this because Bill Barr ends up handling the case later on after there's a falling out between the original creators, Inslaw, and the DOJ. But as I've said before, that takes you away, the cover-up by Bill Barr takes you away from the fundamental reason why they created the software or why the software was commissioned in the first place, the idea of a DEA informant. And most specifically, the reason why Bob Maxwell's in the story, obviously, because he used the software and sold it to a whole bunch of people, including potentially Osama bin Laden, through a guy named Robert Hansen, an FBI leaker named Robert Hansen. The reason why you want to sell this to different countries is to one of two things. You can identify operatives, people who work in the embassy, sort of like our story with McDuff and Scarbeck. You could identify operatives on different targets. You could, let's say, take a person who's been convicted of prostitution. Let's say Dishler was. You can then put her in the service of trying to do takedowns or honeypot operations against different diplomats to test them, to do an assessment, sort of like Trump and Brian McCauley with assessment.pdf. That's one use of it. You can take just regular street criminals and then use them and teach them how to do these sting operations, lures, dangles, or whatever. But the reason why Kissinger liked it so much, and again, Bob Maxwell was using it in the embassies primarily to sort of as a spy tool, sort of as spy leverage, getting secrets, bringing in people from other countries, key assets into Israel, for instance, for the development of the nuclear bomb, espionage for the state of Israel, which I tentatively defend. I know there's a lot of other stuff in the background of the Maxwell family I'll get to in a minute that's not so savory. But where Kissinger and Epstein took this was pilots. Go for the pilots. We're going to take people in the federal penitentiary system, federal penitentiary system, and identify who was an Army pilot, who was a Navy pilot, who was a Marine pilot. And then we approach them and say, hey, how would you like to come work for us? This is the Barry Seal type example where, hey, we want to fly a lot of drugs or Oswald or whoever, pick your favorite pilot. We want to fly drugs from Cuba into the Baton Rouge area, into Lafayette, Louisiana. You can spend the rest of your life in a cell with Bubba, or you can fly planes and have a nice villa and a girlfriend and a Russian girlfriend, etc. That's basically the interest that Kissinger had, and specifically Epstein. The whole thing is, if Barry Epstein is arrested by somebody who's not involved, let's say a state or local police officer for some type of traffic violation or drunk driving or whatever, that you can then look into the CJIS database, the Criminal Justice Information System, which is what the name of it was. And then you can say, hey, wait a minute. This guy is an asset for the federal government. We're going to give him probation. It was called the Prosecutor's Management System, the PROMIS systems, initially. But there was more subtle. The reason why they used the name PROMIS was, if you become a pilot for us, if you go to work for us, we promise that if you ever get caught, as long as you're giving us the money and you're only taking your salary, we promise to protect you. We promise to protect you. Now, if you ever go against that blood bond, you're dead. But that's the idea of the PROMIS software. Now, Danny Casolaro obviously wrote about this. I stood in Rockville on the MARC train platform to go to Martinsville, where Danny Casolaro was going, to where this group was based in West Virginia, this sort of underground group called the Brotherhood. I almost went one weekend to go to Danny Casolaro's hotel room to stay in that, where he was murdered or supposedly committed suicide by slitting his wrists in the tub there. But the whole idea was, he was trying to go and figure out the root of the CJIS system. He had, along with Gary Webb, along with Michael Rupert, identified the game, which was the pilot side of this, the Barry Seal side of how the DOJ was using this, right? So he's not investigating the Bob Maxwell side. Lots of articles have come out about Bob Maxwell now and selling CGI or the PROMIS software to Osama bin Laden. That's for running covert operations, two separate things. One's drugs, one's weapons, one's espionage, okay? Just want to keep those two separate very clearly. So we have the Danny Casolaro writing about this. We have Gary Webb writing about this with Iran-Contra. We have Michael Rupert being a whistleblower about this. The classic example is Barry Seal is caught somewhere, I think it's in Alabama, flying a short haul to Ruckert, or one of the airfields from Cuba or Haiti. I can't remember. It switched to Haiti, obviously, at some point. They actually called Bill Clinton. They called Bill Clinton at the White House. Hey, do you know this guy named Barry Seal? I think it's even dramatized by Tom Cruise in the movie. And what they want to do is they want to get away from the pilots calling the White House. Not good. The only reason that, for instance, the Mena Airport even exists, or you know about Mena Airport, is because the operation in Lee Harvey Oswald's time was to fly directly into Lafayette, Louisiana. And the only reason they kept going and flying over Louisiana was because the governor said no more using the airfields in Louisiana. And so they kept flying to Mena. And that's the only reason you know Bill Clinton. That's the only reason why you know Barry Seal. That's the only reason you know CJIS or Iran-Contra or Bill Barr's cover-up of Iran-Contra. So we go the extra mile. We connect the dots all the way back to when Bob Maxwell was originally putting these people into the United States, when Kissinger was originally putting these people in the United States. And we're looking hard at Bob Maxwell's connection to a guy named Frank Malina, M-A-L-I-N-A. Who is Frank Malina? Well, Frank Malina is a scientist that was working with JPL, the Joint Propulsion Laboratory in California. Spends a lot of time at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. White Sands is interesting because it's very close to where all the V-2 rocket engineers come into the United States in Fort Bliss, and then they send off all their V-2s in White Sands. Now this Frank Malina is a NASA scientist. He is a rocket expert, and he's a rocket expert in what they call sounding rockets, which is suborbital flight, where you're setting up all this instrumentation to do different types of photography, different types of instrumentation, weather instrumentation, and so forth. Was Frank Malina, now the connection to Bob Maxwell is, that's I believe he was a friend of Bob Maxwell's, but it's the father-in-law of Ghislaine Maxwell. Again, this is the key to Bob Maxwell, working with people who are trying to get intellectual capital out to Israel. That's the key to Bob Maxwell, and I want to so brightly draw a bright line between Kissinger and Epstein with the drugs and trying to identify pilots, and Bob Maxwell trying to do espionage. I know you can feel one way or the other about spying and espionage, but I want to draw a bright line there. So Frank Molina ends up leaving White Sands after all the Nazis come in, after Werner von Braun and all that. All those folks get situated or installed in White Sands, and then he goes on and seemingly does a lot of spy activity in the University of California system before he flees the country, with the FBI kind of looking into his activities, and being sort of installed in the French Mossad in France.